This is Think Tech Live, Think Tech Now, Think Tech Strong. Ray, what do you think?
It's Think Tech.
That's Ray Starling, my co-host here on Think Tech Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, our flagship energy show every Wednesday, 4 o'clock. And Veronica Rocha from the State Energy Office at DBED. Say hi.
Hi, everybody.
That's it.
That's all I want to say for now, but I have plenty to say for the rest of the show.
And our old friend, Don Thomas, come from the Big Island, volcanoes man, studying geophysics and volcanology, just like Dr. Spock, for years and years and years. Welcome back.
Thank you. I enjoy being here. Thank you for the opportunity.
So today I'm given to understand we're going to talk about geothermal. You know, we haven't had that much discussion about it lately. It seems to be one of those things that's sort of fallen off a little bit. But the history of geothermal is so interesting, Don, and you were there. In fact, I would say you spent your life around geothermal. Isn't that true?
Well, I have to say that my entire professional career has involved geothermal. I started as a graduate student in 1975, working on geothermal, and have been at it to a greater or lesser degree since that time.
Yeah. And you were there during the tumultuous days of the 90s, when everything was up in the air and
Yes. Well, it's been an interesting lifetime experience.
And to some extent it still is. So what's the state policy on geothermal, Veronica?
Absolutely. So for the Hawaii State Energy Office, we really want to see a portfolio of renewable energy technologies. And a lot of the focus lately has been on solar and wind and how we get more distributed energy resources. But what about geothermal? So that is the topic of today's show. And from our perspective, geothermal, even though it is being considered for the Hawaii company's power supply improvement plan, is being considered in the latter years, right? So part of what I'm hoping we can talk about today is what sort of data, what sort of information needs to be gathered, what sort of community input needs to be obtained so that geothermal is considered in the earlier years of the resource plans for the utilities in Hawaii.
You know, Ray, they're asking for community input. Let's start with you. What kind of input would you give? What do you think of geothermal?
Well, I think it's a great resource that we should be doing more of, and I hope that we get into why we haven't done more of it.
Well, let's get into. We want to do that, but what is good about geothermal? Why do we like geothermal?
I'll take that. I'll take that. Okay. Much of the discussion recently, in some quarters anyway, is that, well, we can do everything with solar and we can do everything with wind. And those are the only renewables we need. But one of the biggest challenges with solar and wind is simply that they are unreliable. They do not produce 24 hours a day. And in a modern society, we need to have a reliable source of power. And the major advantage that geothermal as a renewable resource brings is that it really is available on demand. It is dispatchable power in the sort of the terminology of the utility.
Qu'est-ce que c'est dispatchable?
Basically, by dispatchable, when the grid needs the power, a geothermal power plant can deliver that power as needed.
Instantly.
Instantly.
Yeah.
And we've actually seen on the Big Island, we have a very high degree of penetration of both wind and solar. But the utility is always in the position of chasing load. Essentially, they have no control over how much solar is coming in or not coming in on a minute-by-minute basis. And if they want to maintain their frequency and voltage, they have to be able to provide the power that's demanded essentially second by second. And with rooftop solar and wind energy, you simply can't do that. You would have to have a very massive storage system, essentially a utility scale storage system, to be able to store that energy, excess solar and wind that's being produced, and be able then to make it available to the grid on demand. And we really don't have the technology to do that on a broad scale.
Talking about batteries and all that.
Well, yes, batteries.
Don't need batteries with geothermal because it's dispatchable.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's pretty good. So my recollection, you can correct me anywhere along the way here, is First, it was in the 90s, it was another company, and there was a lawsuit, and that company went out of business, but Ormat
Ormat.
stepped in. Ormat had been a contractor consultant, stepped in, and then
Well,
recreated the.
It was a little more complicated than that. Actually, the history was that back in 1975, beginning actually in 1972, and this was in response to the oil shocks. The university undertook a project initially with funding from National Science Foundation and then from the Department of Energy, or what is now the Department of Energy, and did some exploration pretty much statewide, and they identified an area in Puna that showed evidence that a geothermal resource was present. And they were able to obtain funding to drill an exploration well in the lower Puna area. And at the time, once the well was completed, it was the hottest geothermal well that had been drilled in the world at the time.
When you say hot, that means great for geothermal
That was
energy.
very good news for geothermal. The temperature of the water at the bottom of the well was about 675 degrees Fahrenheit. That really was the first strong evidence that we had a geothermal resource in Hawaii. There were actually many gainsayers that said, well, no, in a basaltic volcano, you can't have a geothermal resource. But once the well was drilled and temperatures were verified, the well was tested, and then a small geothermal power plant was built, 3.5 megawatt
The
power
university had been involved all along the way. Huh?
Well, in a peripheral way. I mean, we were trying to provide sort of the scientific data and sort of the technical data that we had the expertise to provide. Actually, at the time, the Department of Business, I think as it was called at the time, it was before the Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism sort of evolved, but they were part of a management group along with Department of Energy and the university and other entities from the county, all participated in the management of that demonstration power plant. And it came online in early 1982 and produced until 1989, at which point it was shut down because by that time there was sufficient commercial interest then to try to develop a resource. And Ormat, or what ultimately the lease that is now occupied by Ormat was one of the competitors, and then there was another, there were actually two other geothermal companies that had proposed to do development in the Puna area. Ormat and Puna Geothermal Venture was the only survivor, so to say, of those three efforts towards larger scale geothermal.
So it's been going ever since.
Yes.
And it's, but the big question, which is really the central question of our discussion, as Ray suggested, is what limitations are on there? I recall there was like 38 megawatts at one point, and then there was an increase, after a long time, there was an increase to something like 48 or 50. Where are we now?
Well, the actual capacity right now is still about at 38.
Oh, is that right?
And again, the company that is I believe entirely owned by Ormat is Puna Geothermal Venture. They have the capacity to produce about 38 megawatts. They have permits to produce up to 60 from the existing lease.
Why don't they do that?
Basically,
this is good dispatchable power. It's great. Everybody wants this power. Why don't they do
well,
that?
one of the reasons is that the current capacity that Hawaii Electric Light Company has, they have sort of their base load oil-fired generation, and one of the unique or somewhat unique aspects of Hawaii's energy picture or electrical grid picture is that we vary during a 24-hour cycle on the Big Island from something in the neighborhood of 185 megawatts of demand down to somewhere in the range of 60 megawatts. So we have this huge swing during the day, and Helco can only reduce their power production from their base load to a certain minimum level.
Oh, I see.
And so what has to happen actually is at that minimum load level, they have to curtail, in other words, cut back on accepting power from the independent power producers. So part of our problem is that we have these very wide swings on the Big Island. We have no industry that operates 24 hours. And so during the minimum nighttime hours, the demand is quite low.
How do you fix that?
I'm afraid that's a
We
question.
never promised you a rose garden in this discussion.
I would guess that there are a number of ways of modifying that demand curve. One of the things I know that's been in discussion, and maybe Veronica can speak more knowledgeably about this, but there is discussion of sort of pricing by time of day to try to shift some of that load to the minimum hours of the day. If, say, the county were to minimize its use of pumps for their water supply system during the day so they could maximize it during the nighttime hours, that would boost the demand during the nighttime hours. Likewise with consumers with electric hot water heating, if there was an incentive for them to put a time controller on their water heaters, then they could also shift some of that load to the nighttime hours. But it is a difficult problem, and
Well, but technology could solve this problem. I mean, if we had technology to balance the load hither and yon among all the suppliers and all the people who create the load, then this wouldn't be a problem. Everybody
it
would
would
be
be
able to
less of a
contribute.
problem. It would be, I think, less of a problem.
Yeah.
I think at the end of the day, like Don said, it's about balancing the demand with the supply, right? And so there was, just recently, Helco had issued an RFP. Initially, I believe it was 50 megawatts, right? That got whittled down to, was it
25 megawatts,
25
right.
megawatts. Again, it was the final contestant was again Ormat.
Yes.
They, at the end of the day, a negotiation between Helco and Ormat could not be met. My understanding is that part of the impediment is that Hawaii County has a nighttime drilling ban, and Ormat just couldn't get past that. So it made that expansion of the current facility very difficult for them to be able to realize. So I think there's that aspect that needs to be looked at, whether I'll call it like the policy and like the regulatory realm to really provide for more development of geothermal. But other things that could expand the load of and to basically expand geothermal development. What about if the islands were connected? And maybe that could be something that we
Undersea cable.
Right, undersea cable. I know that, and maybe Don, you can provide a little bit more of the historical context with regards to, I know that, I think it dates back to what, the 70s or the 80s when there was discussion of connecting the
Yes.
Big Island
Yep.
to the other islands and really taking advantage of geothermal resources beyond the Big Island.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
you can
Yeah,
talk a
well,
little bit about
they
that.
did have a cable study, and it was actually quite an aggressive one. One of the biggest challenges that was identified was essentially transmitting the power from the Big Island to Maui, because there's a very deep channel there, somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 foot depth. And there was question whether it would be possible to install the undersea cable in a fashion that would essentially be durable, I guess. And essentially, would you be able to put the cable where you had surveyed a path that would minimize risks to the cable? And in fact, they built what they called a surrogate cable that had all of the physical characteristics of a utility-sized cable. And they laid it using a cable ship. They picked it back up and put it back down. Essentially, they were able to navigate along their predetermined path both times. So they demonstrated that that really was not a technical challenge,
Yeah.
that they were able to meet that technical
I remember the
challenge.
concern
Yeah.
about that,
Yeah.
because if you have 6,000, 7,000 foot depth and you drop cable, which in great lengths is very heavy, off the fantail of a cable ship, there's so much weight that it could actually pull the ship down. So that's one of the reasons why cable cannot be laid in very deep ocean areas, and that channel is very deep. When we come back, I'd like to talk about the possibility of converting this energy to hydrogen and moving it around the state that way. I know HNEI has been looking into that, and I wonder how far we've gotten. Okay, this is Hawaii, the state of clean energy. You're not kidding. This is serious discussion. This is very important. We have Don Thomas and Veronica Rocha. We're going to explore the depths, as it were. And Ray Starling will be right back.
Aloha! I'm Chantel Seville, host of the Savvy Chick Show on Think Tech Hawaii. This show is for you. It's all about inspiring and empowering girls of the future to do what they love, get out there, and be healthy, fit, and confident. If you're up for that, 11 a.m. every Wednesday, I'll see you there.
Aloha, my name is Reg Baker, and I'm the host of Business in Hawaii with Reg Baker. Business in Hawaii is a program that is positive stories about business in Hawaii. We're tired of hearing the negativity and why it's the wrong place to have a business. We talk about the positive reasons for having a business in Hawaii and how to be successful. We broadcast live every Thursday at 2 o'clock. We look forward to seeing you. Aloha.
Aloha, I'm Kirsten Baumgart-Turner, and I'm fortunate to be able to host Sustainable Hawaii at thinktechhawaii.com. I hope you'll join in with us every Tuesday from 12 noon to 1 p.m. to see the interesting people we have to share with you their information. Aloha.
We're back, we're live. We're talking about geothermal with Don Thomas, the very daddy of geothermal in Hawaii. Okay, and Veronica Rocha, who looks at him across the way from DBED and develops policy around this. But you know, something you said, Veronica, you said they got a rule in the Big Island about drilling at night. You know, I've been to Puna, and the Puna Geothermal Venture is in the middle of nowhere. You could explode things there, nobody would hear it, tell you. It's really far away from everything. What is the problem about drilling at night?
The concern from the community, as I understand it, is the noise that the drilling produces. And so the specific ban is no nighttime drilling within a 1 mile radius of wherever the drilling is taking place. So that was something that was passed, an ordinance back in, I believe, 2012, Don? Yeah, and has been 13. Yeah, it has been in effect ever since.
Yeah, that sounds very constructive. Okay, moving right along. What about hydrogen? You can take energy, any source, including renewables, including geothermal, and you can make it into hydrogen with a, what do you call that machine? Electrolyzer. Okay, and then you can put them in tanks like Stan Osserman has in HCAT there on Cook Street, and you can move these tanks. They're about 10, 15 feet long. I don't know, they're pretty long and heavy, but they contain a lot of hydrogen, and you can move them all around the state on barges, and you can run generators everywhere using this stored hydrogen. Why don't we do that?
Why not? I mean, it's one of the things that I know HCAT is very interested in. And I mean, sidebar conversation, last year I had the privilege of going to Fukuoka, not just meeting with the Fukuoka Prefecture, but also visiting their Hydrogen Research Center. And currently what they're doing is that they are taking basically byproducts of their steel plants in order to generate methane. Hydrogen.
Yeah, we like hydrogen a lot more than methane.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that I'm currently working on is how can we collaborate with Fukuoka, and in particular this hydrogen research that is being conducted there with the efforts that are being here to do exactly what you're doing, Jay, what you're talking about, Jay, and expanding the use of hydrogen throughout Hawaii. I don't know, Don, what is being done in, for example, in the Big Island with regards to hydrogen? Anything that you're aware of?
Well, I know that there were discussions of trying to develop a hydrogen production facility at the Puna Geothermal Venture plant. They were trying to do a demonstration facility there for hydrogen fueled vehicles. And I haven't heard much about that recently, so I don't know whether that whole negotiation has run into trouble or not. But you know, to bring up sort of the public perception, I know there was discussion of also having a hydrogen fueling facility at the Natural Energy Laboratory of Hawaii Authority, and apparently that got into trouble as well.
That's, I mean, in Nelha.
At the Nelha in Kona.
Why did it get into trouble? It seemed like a really good idea.
Well, I think it goes back to, and I think a lot of the challenges we've had with geothermal all goes back to public perceptions and public education. For some reason, and this is sort of some of the feedback I got from the folks at the Natural Energy Lab, they said that residents in the community were saying, well, we don't want a hydrogen bomb in our community. I mean, there was just sort of this
Let me say for the record
misunderstanding.
that hydrogen from the Puna geothermal venture is not like a hydrogen bomb. There's no
course it's not.
actually
It has
comparison at all. And
no
you're right
relation.
about public education. But
Yeah.
the elephant
Yeah.
in the room is that people object in the Big Island more than any other island. And they have more resources in the Big Island anyway. They object to taking geothermal out of the ground because on cultural grounds. And this has been going on a long time. And I thought, I'm interested in your thought about that, I thought that Mililani Trask, who opposed geothermal to, the very end of the earth back in the 90s and was really very militant about it, then she decided in the early 2000s or the middle 2005 or so, that she wanted to do her own geothermal because she knew she sort of back from the wild and she wanted to do this herself. Whatever happened?
Well, I think, what happened, I can certainly sort of address that evolution because I know that Mililani very proudly abused me for being a proponent of geothermal back in the early days. But what happened was that she went to New Zealand and she had an opportunity to see the geothermal development that is going on there, has gone on there, and had an opportunity to work with the Maori community because the Maori community has ownership rights to some of that geothermal resource. And she was able to help them move forward on that development and saw the benefits to the community. And I think she came around. She realized that the same kind of thing could happen in Hawaii that would be of direct benefit to the Hawaiian community.
Yeah.
And so I certainly do not criticize her. Right? She was able to take new information and get a new perspective on the value of geothermal.
Last time I saw her, she organized a joint hearing of the energy committees and other committees in the legislature. The people were hanging off a chandelier, and she was presenting with all her friends, including friends from Wall Street, who were going to put together this huge big deal about geothermal for Native Hawaiian people. And that's all last I heard of it. It stopped talking about it.
I think
after that.
part of the issue was that there was the invitation for proposal that Hawaii Electric Light Company had out, and I'd have to say the timing was not ideal because the other competitors had very little information that they could really bring to the table and say, okay, we have a viable resource here, and we can develop it. So Helco had very little option because Ormat clearly had by far more data on the geothermal resource that they controlled. And I think basically that when Ormat was selected, the other groups essentially had to retire from the field until another opportunity arose.
But there are other sources of geothermal in Hawaii. Most of them, I would imagine, are on a Big Island, but I've heard talk that some of them are on Maui and could be even further west. So why don't we make exploration here? Why don't we get going and find geothermal in everybody's backyard?
Well, it's a challenging endeavor. We completed a recent study, essentially compiling available earth science data, and that was a fairly substantial job. We had to look at well temperatures and well chemistry and compile relevant geologic data and relevant geophysical data and put it all together essentially once we had it in hand we developed a probability model and did sort of an assessment on a uniform basis of resource potential for all of the islands. And what that did is it helped us identify, to a degree, whether there was any prospective resource on the older islands.
Conclusions?
The conclusions was that we certainly, we have evidence that resources exist on Maui, potentially on Lanai. We have some, although considerably weaker evidence on Oahu, but sort of to put as positive a spin on it as I can, we certainly can't categorically say there's no possibility of a resource on Oahu.
Yeah. So Veronica, you know, taking all this together, we have a great resource. It's probably good for thousands of years. It's dispatchable. The development cost versus the benefit it really works well economically. But we have this cultural objection that keeps popping up about it that I don't fully understand. And now the state is in the middle of all that. Your office is in the middle of all that. You say balance, you know, we're gonna have a little of this, a little of that. We're not really developing geothermal as much as we might. We haven't been able to do that. What's the plan?
Yeah, so the plan is currently being developed, and so maybe if we can take a step back, right? So the integrated resource plan, as we know, the PUC said, no, it's defunct. We need to move towards a different type of planning regime. And so now we're moving towards the power supply improvement plan and developing those. And the first round of that also was, you know, it wasn't as fully vetted as the PUC would have liked. So now we're moving into the PSIP update. What is new is that our office has collaboratively engaged with the utilities on developing a plan that hopefully will pull in more of the stakeholder input. And as part of that, we have facilitated now, I believe, 3 various stakeholder meetings. Now, specifically, what is the plan for geothermal? The issue with geothermal is, you know, the resource is fairly well understood around the existing plant, but what about all of the other, you know, resources that are geothermal resources potential throughout the various islands? And, you know, the work, the phase 1 that Don and his team did in compiling all of this information, existing information about geothermal resources, I think is the first step in developing the type of information that the utility needs in order to include geothermal in its resources.
You know, we've been talking about this for as long, I think it was before I was born. We're talking about this, maybe,
Like
but
that
certainly
long.
before you
Yeah.
were born.
You know-
and you say first step, you know, what can we do to actually do something already? These guys, what do you think? 100 megawatts easy at Puna, easy.
Yeah, easily.
So, you know, why don't we use that? It just seems like a huge waste for no good reason. When are we going to get, Ray, we're about to
agree.
close. Why don't you express your views and close, okay?
Well, my views are, this has been very eye-opening for me. I thought I knew a lot about the geothermal situation, but what I'm really surprised at is where we're at today, given where we could be today. It seems like this is a proven resource that just needs some pieces to come together and make it happen. And that gives me some hope, maybe. And it may not be that it's used to put electricity on the grid. It might be to make hydrogen, to have a hydrogen economy. That's what the dream of some is, right?
You know, you may not be the whole community, Ray, but you're my community. and I know that Veronica is listening.
Yes, all right.
Okay, this is great. Great discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you, Don. Thank you,
you.
Veronica. Thank you, Ray. We'll be back for more on Think Tech, Hawaii, the state of clean energy. Aloha, you guys.